Hello friends, and welcome to our latest video. Today we're going to look into some unsolved national park and national recreation area murders. There are many reasons why people flock these days to YouTube videos, news articles, and other forms of media, both mainstream and social, especially to unsolved mysteries and crimes. When something happens that either cannot be explained or that the proper authorities have a hard time solving, it lets us, whether an armchair detective, suburban housewife, or any other random person with a normal and somewhat generic title, speculate and add our opinions, theories, and ideas into the investigation, and that sometimes makes us feel like we could possibly be helping to solve the enigma. When it comes to unsolved murders in particular, regular people, meaning non-law enforcement or a usual authority who would be investigating such things, feel like we are a part of the solution, but also, in a way, a part of bringing not only justice to our community, but some form of closure to a family. There are also those of us who don't like unsolved mysteries simply due to the extreme anxiety that not knowing seems to cause. Whatever your interest in such things may be, we think you'll find this string of unsolved murders in our national parks interesting, heartbreaking, nonsensical, but also terrifying. Isn't there enough going on in the national parks, national forests, and wilderness areas already? Possibly having a serial killer in the midst of the places where we go to spend quality time off-grid with our family, loved ones, Girl and Boy Scouts, troops, etc., is especially terrifying. Most of the time, graffiti, vandalism, and perhaps even some trash dumping are the worst of the crimes you'll see on public lands. It's extremely rare not to have a crime, but to have violent crime in a national forest or park, or even just your run-of-the-mill remote woodland area or forest. It's unnerving and even somewhat creepy to know that while hiking a random trail for the day, there could be another human stalking and hunting you along the same path. Now, according to the FBI, you have a tiny 1 in a million chance of even being assaulted in a national park. Your chance of being randomly assaulted walking down the street is 3,100 times more than that in most urban areas. Now, while the authorities who investigate such unlikely crimes urge us to use common sense and caution, sometimes you or a loved one end up being that one person in a million, regardless of how careful, learned, or smart you are. Let's explore and examine the information and facts of the crimes being committed in Shenandoah National Park first, and see what kind of conclusions we can arrive at while we sit back, praying and hoping the authorities get to the bottom of this soon, so we can go back to fearing what is unknown in the woods again. First up, Julianne Marie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans. They were murdered in Shenandoah State Park in 1996. The investigation into the unsolved murders of Julianne Marie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans in 1996 is still active to this day in 2021. While at one point the authorities did think they had the man who committed these horrible crimes, they had to let him go, and thus the rumor and speculation started as to what could have and or might have possibly happened to these two innocent young women. Let's take a look at the facts of this case. Both women were in their 20s and from the New England area and were planning on spending Memorial Day weekend in the Shenandoah National Park. They arrived on May 19th and were just looking forward to a fun and relaxing time, enjoying the outdoors and everything nature has to offer. They camped in a very secluded spot, facing the eastern part of Stony Man Mountain. 9 days after first arriving at the park, on May 28th, the two women were reported missing when they both failed to show up for work and hadn't called in. 4 days after they were officially reported missing, on June 1st, the women were unfortunately found deceased at their campsite. They were both found in the nude and had their wrists bound with duct tape and coverings over their mouth. Both women had also had their throats cut, but hadn't been sexually assaulted. There was nothing missing from the camp except for Lolly's personal belongings, such as her journal and driver's license. Of course, when this case hit the media, there was massive attention and major focus on it. Hundreds of tips were called in to investigators, but not a single one managed to produce any leads. The case eventually went cold, though was still being investigated when the random and stray lead would come in from time to time. A year later, in 1997, a man named Darrell David Rice was convicted of stalking and assaulting a woman bicycling on Skyline Drive in the Shenandoah National Park and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The more federal officials looked into Darrell and his crimes, the more they were able to make the connections of him possibly being in the park at the same exact time as Lolly and Julianne had been there. In fact, they were able to see and positively identify him using security cameras entering and leaving the park during the women's vacation. A fellow inmate who played in a prison band with Darrell Rice testified against him and told authorities that Darrell had confessed to actually killing women in the park. He was indicted in 2002 for the murders of Julianne and Lolly. However, 2 years later, prosecutors were forced to drop all charges against him due to conflicting information and what they termed as unstable evidence. There were holes in the prosecution's case. An example of why their case fell apart is a couple who were also camping in the park denied the murders and the testimony they gave. The male witness who came forward said he had noticed a creepy man staring at him from across a clearing while he was relaxing in his campsite with his wife. When asked if he could pick the man's photo out of a lineup, he did choose Darrell David Rice, but went on to say he was only about 65 to 70% sure that this was the strange man he had seen. This man's wife also gave testimony which was considered a bit questionable, when she said that not only had she heard screams throughout the campground on the night in question, but that she had also been able to astrally project out of her body and further explore the crime scene. Needless to say, this wasn't exactly considered scientific evidence, and even when it did come to the science of the matter, it seemed also to clear Darrell Rice rather than indict him. DNA found on the duct tape belonging to a male did not match Darrell's DNA. In the summer of 2016, the FBI decided to re-examine this case and try to get it solved once and for all. Darrell Rice was released from prison in 2007 and, after being incarcerated 2 more times after this release on some nondescript parole violations, police in Durango, Colorado, had to make a public appeal for calm when there was some talk on social media about Darrell Rice being spotted in the area, and the news seemed to have hit the public very hard, scaring many of the locals who were either already familiar with the case or had just recently become familiar when the social media buzz had hit. The local police departments were getting call after call after call about the possibility that maybe a killer was in their midst. Back in Virginia, however, the case of the murders of Julianne and Lolly are an open investigation, even if they are cold. The anniversary of the crime always comes with a bittersweet, renewed interest. It dredges up the fear of the case being unsolved and the heartbreak of what happened to these poor women and the effect it had on the community, not to mention their families, but also the hope of perhaps the right tip finally coming in and the case being solved once and for all. Anyone with information about the 2 ladies' deaths, please contact the FBI's Richmond office at 804-261-1044 or go to tips.fbi.gov. Next up, we have Scott Lilly, murdered on the Appalachian Trail in 2007. Being described as a Civil War enthusiast by family and friends, it should be no surprise that when 31-year-old Scott Lilly set out on a journey of exploration and self-discovery, that he chose the trail name Stonewall, as in General Stonewall Jackson, being in reference to the Confederate general. Scott was from South Bend, Louisiana, and decided to take this trip of finding a meaning to life in general as well as his own, and set out to hike the Appalachian Trail from Maryland to Georgia. Unfortunately, however, his journey ended tragically in Amherst County, Virginia. In July of 2011, when he was climbing a landmark mountain in Nelson County known as the Priest, Scott made his last contact with family and friends. About a month later, in August of 2007, a group of hikers out for a weekend of fun and relaxation happened to cross his body. It was located in a shallow grave just off a trail near a place called Cow Camp Gap in the Mount Pleasant National Scenic Area of George Washington National Forest. None of his gear was anywhere near his body, including his shoes and his backpack. A medical examiner ruled that Scott had died from asphyxia by suffocation. Because his death had occurred on public lands, it was being investigated by the FBI. They determined that his death was in fact a homicide, and in the days following their initial investigation, they tried in vain to contact several other hikers who had been known to be on the same trails around the same time that Scott was murdered. These people were known by the trail names Mr. Coffee, White Wolf, Papa Smurf, Combat Gizmo, and Space Cadet. All this time later, and no arrests have been made. Despite so much rumor and speculation, there's been no evidence in the case and therefore nothing to lead the FBI to any suspect. Anyone with information about Scott Lilly's death should contact the FBI's Richmond office at 804-261-1044 or go to tips.fbi.gov. Next up, Heidi Childs and David Metzler, murdered in Caldwell Fields, 2009. Heidi Childs and David Metzler had been together for 4 years in the fall semester of their sophomore year in college in 2009. On the evening of August 26, the couple drove out Craig Creek Road to a recreation site in the Jefferson National Forest called Caldwell Fields to talk and play guitar. The next morning, a man out walking his dog came across David's 1992 Toyota Camry and thought nothing of it at first, but then proceeded to take a few steps closer when he thought he saw something lying on the ground outside the vehicle. There, he found Heidi's body on the outside and David still inside the car. Both had been shot with a .30-30 caliber rifle sometime between 8:30 and 10 p.m. the previous night. The Montgomery County Sheriff reported the crimes were brutal and ugly when addressing the news media and the public for the first time soon after the bodies had been discovered. In 2012, after the case went completely cold, despite a coalition of law enforcement working together on it and a $70,000 reward, authorities released new information to the public in hopes of generating some new leads. The first detail was that DNA evidence had been taken from the scene and was tested against some nearby residents, who were kept anonymous due to the ongoing investigation. And the second detail released at this time was that Heidi's purse, which included her cell phone and credit cards, had been stolen or at least taken from the scene. No arrests have been made still to this day in August of 2021. However, this is not a cold case. This is still a very active investigation, said Lieutenant Kenny Light. Montgomery County law enforcement officials request anyone with information about this crime to contact them. They're looking for information on people or vehicles that may have been in the area that night. You can contact Lieutenant Light at 540-382-6915, extension 44422, or write to him at lightdm@montgomerycountyva.gov. Well, there you have it. What do you think of these tragic cases of senseless murder in our national parks, forests, and recreation areas? I look forward to your comments, but we do ask that you please remain respectful of the victims' families, and the opinions of each other. In the meanwhile, be good to yourselves and each other. I'll see you just a little farther on down the road. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.